decided on the day of the takeover that we wanted to put a marker down to say that we didn't want a bloody dictatorship run our club. And in that journey, we've held protests, we've delivered a letter on behalf of the victims of the Saudi regime to Eddie Howe, which was not acknowledged. We held a protest outside of St James's Park in solidarity with 9 young men, 9 minors. You can see their photos around the wall. And these are young men who were arrested in most cases for demonstrating and tweeting, voicing their opposition to the Saudi regime. They were arrested when they were sometimes 14, 15, 16. And then the Saudi state plays a bit of a cruel game with them. They terrorise their families. They let them out of prison because the Saudi regime signed an international agreement where they said that they wouldn't execute people under 18, minors. That's what it says on that. But then when they came to 18, they were all rearrested and put on death row. And they're currently on death row. And we were outside St James's Park and we said we're going to do a silent protest and basically asking people to acknowledge that the people who own the club, this is what they do in the country. But we said we're going to have a silent protest, but it wasn't silent because a lot of Newcastle fans came up and spoke to us and asked us about what was going on. Then another part of the journey is that we've published 3 fanzines, 3 editions of our fanzines, and it's called Hailstones in the Desert. Now, I want to explain why it's called Hailstones in the Desert, okay? Because at the beginning, when we started, we were told, if you are in favour of human rights, if you're talking about the ownership of the club, you're a snowflake. And at that time, we met some Saudi human rights groups, and they were talking to us. And one of the things that struck us was how brave these people are, that they actually stand up for human rights in a country where basically you can be executed for tweeting. There's a man this week, what's his name? Who has been condemned to death for 10 tweets and I think about 10 followers. This is the reality. So we said, no. The activists, the people like Lina, who you've come here to listen to, who stand up for human rights in Saudi Arabia, they're not snowflakes. They're hard, like hailstones. So it's a dedication to human rights fighters in Saudi Arabia, hailstones in the desert. We've also participated in conferences and with Saudi activist groups, and we've managed to get, with a long, hard struggle, to get this on the agenda in Newcastle, and it's fantastic that everyone's come tonight. And there's a lot to say, so I'm not going to take up too much time. I'm saying we're going to listen to Lina later. We've got someone from FairSquare. Now this is a bit of an experiment because we've got technical difficulties. I'm going to put Nic on from FairSquare later, and if you can hear him, fantastic. If not, we'll move on to the next speaker. But that will be for later. But Nic's with us today from FairSquare, who wrote a report about the Saudi regime and the Abu Dhabi regime buying Manchester City and Newcastle. And later we have Andrew Page from Newcastle United fans against sports washing, who's going to speak for 10 minutes. But I'd like to introduce Colin Taylor from the local Amnesty. Is also involved with the subgroup, Saudi subgroup, and we've worked a little bit with Amnesty, and they've assisted us on a couple of protests, and we thank them for that. So over to Colin for about 10 minutes. Yeah? Okay,
thank you. Well, thanks very much, John, and thanks for the invitation. Really much appreciated. So, you probably know about all the different issues that come up. You know about the executions. You know about the persecution of many minorities in Saudi Arabia, notably the Shiite minority. You know about the gender issues and the difficult way that that's actually developing, and the poor treatment of foreign workers which is pretty much equivalent to what's gone on in Qatar. And recently, of course, there was this outburst on the Saudi border where many foreigners trying to get in from Yemen were shot at and killed by Saudi forces. So we've done these petitions. I've actually got sheets here today if anyone has the time to sign afterwards. On behalf of Salma and Abdurrahman, we would have liked to do one on Nora as well, but there really doesn't seem to be very much information out about Nora al-Qatani, and Amnesty hasn't actually drafted anything about her specifically. Moving on from there, we have been fairly active in terms of contacting MPs about the issues in Saudi Arabia. And I know at the time of the takeover, there was felt to be a little bit of a conspiracy of silence amongst local politicians and MPs. They didn't really want to speak out about it in any way. But I can say that I think as time has gone on, the response has tended to improve. So, for example, I went to see Liz Twist in Bladen and told her about the petitions which she spontaneously offered to present to Parliament. I don't know if this has ever happened, but certainly stuff was handed over. And she also has spoken out, along with Peter Bottomley, in the House of Commons about the Yemen war. Quite a good response was with Chien Wara also at that particular time, Richard's from MP, and also through contacts in other groups. We got Bridget Phillipson, the Sunderland, who wrote to Lord Tariq Ali of Wimbledon, Foreign Office Minister with responsibility for Saudi Arabia, to ask him the sort of things that they were trying to do to persuade Saudi Arabia to go down a different course. Perhaps the most surprising one, through our friends in Berwick, is we got quite a good response from Anne-Marie Trevelyan as well. Not really answering some of the questions that we were asking, but certainly endorsing the case of Salma al-Shihab, which has taken off to some extent in the Commons as a result of the efforts of Hilary Benn, the Leeds North MP. The sort of things we were covering with MPs did vary a little bit. We drew attention to the ALQST 19 recommendations to the UK Parliament. We mentioned the People's Vision for Reform, which Lina, I think, knows well about, because she's one of the signatories. We also believe it's important to do stuff about the specialised criminal courts, because they're instrumental in all these ridiculously dramatic sentences, and particularly a guy called Alwad Al-Amari, who is the chief of the specialised criminal courts, seems to have had a role in the Khashoggi murders, but has yet to be sanctioned by the British government. We probably don't have the visibility of some other groups, but we do write a good letter. We've taken an interest in the issue of NEOM and the fact that many British firms are getting involved in investing in NEOM. And in particular, there is a firm called Oliver Wyman with a strong presence in the Northeast. So we've written to them asking how deep their involvement with the Northeast staff is in Saudi Arabia, and basically how they square their involvement in Saudi Arabia with the fact that they've signed up to the UN principles on conduct of good business. And that's exactly the right title of the thing. We haven't had a reply, so that's now been redone as an open letter to the press. Don't know if it's been published yet. We've also shown an interest in the fact that the Northeast Economic Forum came out with a strong statement in support of developing trade with Saudi Arabia, and particularly involved there is a firm called Sovereign Strategy, whose chief executive is a chap called Alan Donnelly, former Labour MEP. We've written a letter to them along similar lines, because they're signed up to the UN sustainability guidelines. Sustainability in NEOM, interesting concept. And again, we're asking them, how do you square this with your conscience? Getting involved with this mega project, which, as you'll know, has led to massive repression of the Hawaiian minority in the area. On a couple of things within Amnesty, we're showing interest in the fact there is a proposal for a Microsoft data center in Saudi Arabia, and wondering if Amnesty would like to do something more about that. Brilliant idea. Precisely the country that has provided agents to infiltrate all the social media outlets so that the owners of anonymous accounts get divulged to the Saudi regime and the individuals involved get persecuted on a massive basis. They want to have a data center there in Saudi Arabia. Well, we'll see how that goes. Apparently, Amnesty International Secretariat did react a little bit a couple of years back when there was a similar proposal from Google. The other thing we are interested in pursuing is precisely this issue of the murders on the Saudi Arabia-Yemeni border. This came out through a Human Rights Watch report. So we're interested in seeing if Amnesty wants to endorse that report, do endorse it, but wants to produce their own report and take things a good deal further. Oh, and last of all, there is a small issue that Mohammed bin Salman is expected to be visiting very shortly. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Okay, as I said before, we're technical difficulties. We're going to try something, and if it doesn't work, we'll move on to the next speaker and be more time for Lina to speak. But I want to introduce Nic McGeehan, who we've worked with a little bit, and is a co-author of an excellent report. It's called Easy Cities to Buy, okay? And it's a study of how the Abu Dhabi state and the Saudi state managed to entrench themselves in Manchester and in Newcastle. And also, unfortunately, how they managed to silence the press and also silence most politicians. And it goes into the implications of state ownership. So we'll do a little test. If Nic can be heard, we can go ahead. If not, we can recommend this document. So Nic, can you speak just so we can hear you?
Yeah, I'll speak as loud as I can.
Can you hear that?
Waking up my daughter. How's that?
Okay, that's fantastic. Speak like that volume. It's fantastic. Go on. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, John. We wrote this report essentially accusing senior political figures of a lack of civic leadership in both Newcastle and Manchester. We wrote the report because we've done a lot of work in Manchester, looking at the links with Abu Dhabi. And then we were seeing the same pattern play out in Newcastle with the Saudi Arabia takeover. We thought it would be interesting to compare the two and to discuss sports washing, not in terms of what it does for the reputation of the states involved, but what it does on the host cities and what it does for local democracy in places like Newcastle and Manchester. You still hear me?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So listen, Lina, it's great you've got Lina. She's far better placed than I am to talk about what goes on in Saudi Arabia and to those who are directly affected. I can talk a little bit about what we've seen in Newcastle, which I think is probably most interesting for this audience. The first thing to say is the people in charge of that consortium, Amanda Staveley and co., it is inconceivable that they didn't look at Manchester as a blueprint. And there is a simple blueprint for this. You promise money and success to fans. You promise investment and regeneration to politicians. And you hope that local media will not go against the grain. That is precisely what happened in Manchester. And I would say that it's pretty obvious that the same sort of thing has happened in Newcastle. I think it is worthwhile pointing out that a significant pressure was put on MPs in Newcastle. In July 2020, when the consortium withdrew its bid, there was a a famous, well, I think of it as famous moment when Amanda Staveley made this comment saying, "It's up to the fans now." And saying something like, if they want this deal to go through, they'll have to push for it. Now, after that statement was made and relayed via the media, the Newcastle United Supporters Trust issued a call for transparency, and MPs in the North East received more than 1,000 letters in 90 minutes. I'm just going to read out a section of a template letter that was published in the Chronicle shortly after. Here's what it said. It said, "As one of your constituents, I'm asked to attend a polling booth and vote for you. I want to know if you're going to support our concerns or not. If you don't, this will leave me time to be able to pursue someone within our constituency to take this up on my behalf." So that's a lot of pressure. In a town where football is so important to civic pride, fans were piling the pressure on MPs, and it was incredibly effective, I think. I can't recall exactly how many MPs pressured the Premier League under the auspices of transparency, but I believe the figure was something, about 40 MPs eventually wrote to the Premier League. Certain MPs, I would say, went further than that. Ian Mearns and Chion Wora, in particular, mobilised in Parliament. Mearns put a lot of pressure on James Cleverly, the then Middle East Minister for the UK, demanding answers from them and what they were doing to help the deal. And if any of you have read Adam Crafton's reporting in The Athletic, you'll see that the British government was doing everything it could to make that deal go through, with Boris Johnson such a fan of the Saudis. Chion Wora herself presented a petition to Parliament, which she said was on behalf of our fans, again talking about the importance of transparency. But it was very obvious that a lot of pressure was being applied by Newcastle MPs for the deal. Now, I think it's very telling. In October 2021, days after the deal went through, two separate members of the Saudi consortium singled Chion Wora out for thanks. One of them said that Wora was one of the people who made this possible. Now, in singling out Wora myself here, I don't want to be unfair in my criticism of her. I think it's right to be critical of her. But it is also true that she is the MP who has perhaps engaged more seriously with the human rights dimension of this than any others. At the same time, I think she has, wittingly or otherwise, enabled the takeover. And she has never directly challenged Newcastle's owners about their human rights record. Now, after the deal went through, there were statements to the effect of Newcastle will not be silent. Newcastle will stand up for human rights in Saudi Arabia. This spotlight that is now on the city will be used in a positive way. That hasn't happened. As Lina can testify, the rights situation in Saudi Arabia has worsened since the takeover. MPs have been given multiple opportunities to criticise Saudi owners in a meaningful way and to sort of turn the rationale for sports washing on its head and say, you're not going to use this club to launder your reputation. This club is actually going to be used as a tool to pressure you. And that hasn't happened. In August last year, Reprieve, a big NGO who works a lot in Saudi Arabia, wrote to Nick Brown, Catherine McKinnell, Chion Wora and 4 councillors, asking them to set up meetings with Yasser al-Rumayyan to discuss issues including the execution of children. They got no response. A few months later, we wrote a joint letter with al-Qassat, the Saudi organisation that Lina does work for. We wrote to the same MPs. We also wrote to Kate Osborne and Ian Lavery, and we asked them to speak out publicly against executions. We only got responses from Lavery and Wora, and none of the MPs in question actually stood up and aimed a message at the club's owners and said, if you want to be part of this city, if you want to be part of this club, you have to understand that we do not stand by what you are doing. We oppose it, and we want you to stop these practices. That hasn't happened. I think I'll probably stop it there because that's about as much as I expected you to be able to hear, to be honest. But I think the big message that we've seen is that one of the key reasons that these sports washing projects work is that the governments in question know that they can rely on the silence of the political class if enough pressure is put on the political class to stay silent. I think there's some irony that democratic institutions and mechanisms have actually been used here to enable a profoundly anti-democratic and repressive state to set up a power base in the city. But yeah, I'll probably leave it there. I hope you could get all that.
Yes, we did. Thank you very much, Nick. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Now, I want to unveil this. Okay. This is the family Newcastle United shirt. Okay, this is my dad, who was a season ticket holder for years until he died, and then my mother took over the season ticket, and we all used to use it. I think it's illegal now to do that. Now, on the back is Alan Shearer. Okay, I just want to tell a little story, link two stories together about Alan Shearer, because he was my dad's hero. Yeah, and Andrew and I had the privilege. We were contacted on social media by a guy I'm going to call Mr. Ali, because he called us Mr. John and Mr. Andrew, and he's a guy in a Saudi exile group. And we were talking to him on a call, and he really had a big effect on both of us, because one of the things he actually said was, he said, when he saw what happened on the day of the takeover, he said he just couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that people here were celebrating a takeover by the state which oppressed him. This guy was imprisoned and tortured, and then he escaped and set up his human rights group. So we explained, some of the celebration was that Ashley had gone. But he actually said when he was a kid, his hero was Alan Shearer, and that really struck home to us. And people say to her, what are you asking? We're asking people like Alan Shearer, fans groups, and local politicians to stick to what they said pre-takeover. Alan said that that there were issues, concerns about human rights. Well, let's follow that through. Let's talk about it. And to link up to the second point, everyone will remember that Alan Shearer showed solidarity with Gary Lineker. Gary Lineker's right to free speech was threatened by the BBC. And not only Alan Shearer, his colleagues and the technicians on the Match of the Day put down tools. Perhaps some of you here didn't work because of that. We got in touch. We didn't get a reply, but the point that we made was that we agree that the right to free speech of Gary Lineker is worth defending, and good on you, Alan, for almost going on strike with this. But what about the team, the city that you're from, the club which is owned by the Saudi state? What about the free speech rights of Lina's sister? What about the free speech rights of Salma al-Shabaab and Nora al-Qatani? I think that's something we can't avoid. There can't just be free speech for people in Newcastle. What about free speech for people in Saudi? And like it or not, this city is linked to the Saudi regime because of the ownership of the club. So I'd like to introduce Andrew Page, who's been a stalwart of the campaign, and he's going to speak a little bit about his thoughts in the campaign.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Basically, all I'm going to talk about is who I am, the group I'm a member of, what we've been doing, why we've been doing it, and what we're hoping to achieve. So, first of all, Andrew Page. I've been a Newcastle United fan for my entire life. For 32 years, had a season ticket, went to all home matches with my dad, sat in the same seats, and just renewed the ticket every year. And I think if you live here, you kind of appreciate that becoming a Newcastle fan just sort of naturally becomes a part of your identity. If you go into the games and you're living in the community, it's something you talk about all the time. It's just sort of part of who you are. But also, I'm a citizen of the UK, and I've always felt that probably the worst aspect of the UK was probably represented by its relationship with Saudi Arabia. I don't see how you can claim to be a country that upholds human rights while you have a relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think probably the supplying arms to them for the war in Yemen is probably the most shameful thing we've been involved with since Iraq. And I would say probably the only thing that could have made me question being a Newcastle United fan would be if the state of Saudi Arabia took over the club. And then you've got to sort of contend with the idea that you're helping a sports washing project by just turning up and going along with it. In a sense, in however small a way, you're a propagandist for this regime. So that was probably the only thing I could think of that would really make me question it. And obviously, that's what happened. Takeover went through nearly 2 years ago now. And it was very deflating to see all the celebrations following the takeover for me anyway. So the question then for me is, well, what can you do about it? And I've been looking everywhere, really, just looking for some sign of dissent, someone wanting to speak up against this. And there's been a lot of talk in the run-up to the takeover about holding the regime to be account and being critical friends. A lot of ex-players and politicians and so forth, they'd all been saying they were going to do it. I couldn't really see anybody doing that at all. And finally found this group, Newcastle United Fans Against Sports Washing, and went to the online meeting that they held in, I think it was January 2022. And then that was followed up in August 2022 with an in-person meeting. And at those meetings, we discussed alternative ownership models for football clubs, the arms trade, UK and Saudi Arabian involvement in an atrocity in Yemen. And following on from that, I mean, members of the group have done TV interviews, radio interviews locally, and done interviews with media outlets all over the world. I think maybe one thing I was really surprised actually is how much interest there is in this from around the world. There's a lot of people looking at Newcastle now, looking at what's going on and wondering what that means for the future of sports. I don't really think that comes across in the Chronicle and the Journal so much as maybe it could, but there's an awful lot of people with eyes on this, and we're never short of requests for interviews and documentaries and everything you can think of. Probably the most significant thing being a part of is the protest at the Newcastle v Chelsea game just before the World Cup, and that came about really when a group called the European Saudi Organisation for Human Rights got in touch with us. We've been contemplating doing a protest anyway, and they asked us to do it and to highlight the plight of 8 miners on death row, and they're the miners who are sort of on the walls in the room around us. We were more than happy to do that for 2 reasons, really. First of all, these Saudi exiles told us, if you use your platform as fans to speak out, that will have a massive impact on individual cases. And when you see how this regime responds to any sort of dissent, you can see that's probably true. It probably does have a big impact. And also, the other reason I wanted to do it was because this seemed to me exactly the sort of thing a lot of people had said they wanted to do before the takeover, would be holding the owners to account, showing that they didn't represent us at all. And then following on from that, we also delivered, the same organisation got in touch with us again, and they were representing a man whose brother is facing the death penalty in Saudi Arabia. And they were writing to Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo. And they'd also written a letter to Eddie Howe, because, again, really is an international connection that everyone around the world is aware of now between Saudi Arabia and Newcastle. And they asked if we would deliver that letter to him on their behalf. And again, we're more than happy to oblige. So that's the sort of activities we've been involved in. And now, why are we doing this? And I think while there's a lot of people who've said we're going to hold the regime to account, and we haven't really heard from them, but another thing we've heard a lot of is, could we not use this new relationship to try and help the regime to modernise? And we're not talking about human rights abuses committed by the Saudi state more than ever. And in my view, we really aren't at all. I think when you ask yourself, what do you mean by the Saudi state, and what do you mean by the abuses they commit? You can look at some of the individuals who've now been able to associate themselves with Newcastle United. And one that I noticed was prior to the takeover, Saudi Minister for Sport, Prince Turki bin Faisal Al Saud, followed the Newcastle United Twitter account. That story went out in the Chronicle. Now, that man's father is Prince Turki bin Faisal Al Saud. In 2002, he was named in a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit brought by the families of 11 September victims, alleging that he may have funded the terrorists involved in the attack. And although that case was dismissed, the Prince did acknowledge that he's met bin Laden several times in his official capacity, and there isn't anyone who's done more to establish the Taliban in Afghanistan than that man. In 2003, he admitted in a live call-in show that 6 British citizens had been tortured by intelligence agents. So that's the type of person who can now associate himself with Newcastle. And then, after the final home match of the season before last, Newcastle's director thanked the Saudi ambassador to the UK, Prince Khalid Bandar, because he'd gone to the game. And his father's Prince Bandar. And in July 2016, withheld pages from a US congressional report showed that his wife had paid thousands of dollars to a man who directly funded the hijacks. And he's now been asked to give evidence in the US court about it. He was also the main beneficiary of the Al-Yamaha arms deal, which is the most corrupt arms deal the UK has ever been involved in. He was gifted a £75 million claim, and he was paid more than $1 billion in bribes. And then, while Mohammed bin Salman's visit to this country is still controversial, pretty much nothing was made of the fact that his brother was at the Carabao Cup final wearing a black and white scarf. And he's meant to be a very significant figure in the regime. Apparently, his family's money man. And then there's obviously the Newcastle United chairman, who's the governor of the Public Investment Fund, who's personally selected by bin Salman for the job. And after bin Salman confiscated assets in an anti-corruption purge, which apparently involved torture, his job was to transfer those assets. Now, he featured heavily in the recent Amazon documentary, and we saw the entire Newcastle United squad at his home. And that home was purchased for him by bin Salman due to its location near the palace. We've seen him on the pitch at the end of the season wearing a black and white lace jacket, just clowning around on the pitch, soaking up adulation from the fans. So this is who the Saudi state really is. And it just looks to me it's the same families and individuals that were ever there. And when we talk about the atrocities, we're talking about some of the involvement in some of the most significant crimes, atrocities we've seen this century so far. And I don't really hear any of us talking about that at all. You never really hear it mentioned. And if these are the same families from the outside looking in, maybe we'll hear a bit more later, how is all this revolutionary change going to happen if it's the same? I mean, what else could you expect in an absolute monarchy? It's just the same people. So what was always my concern was we were never going to be able to change them. It always seemed far more likely that they were going to change us. And one of the dangers of being owned by a state is rather than representing your city, you start to represent that state a little bit as well. And that seems to me what seems to have happened. In my view, there's been a big shift in the mentality of support. We used to protest against having payday loan companies sponsoring the club. Now there seems to be people that are pretty much generally in favour of having terrible Saudi sponsors because they'll bring in a lot of money. 2 years ago, I saw a poll of the MAG fanzine, and it said most people would like to see a sponsor name incorporated into the stadium name if it was all that money went to the club. And that's a big contrast to a few years back when Mike Ashley renamed the stadium, when there was absolute outcry. And then you look at the kit that we're now wearing. Had a third kit last season. There was a bit of a backlash against that. Clearly in Saudi colours. I didn't really think anybody was going to wear it, but plenty of people did. And now the second kit this year is another Saudi kit. There hasn't been any backlash against that at all. And also, if you watch the Amazon Prime documentary, you can see there's a Saudi journalist featured, and he wears full Saudi regalia. And he goes to St. James's Park, and he has a portrait of bin Salman in one hand. He's got a portrait of the king in the other, the Saudi Arabia flag. And you can see he's walking around the ground outside. He's posing for photos, fans, smiling. Whereas, to contrast that, when we stood outside the ground against Chelsea with posters displaying these men's victims, the police wanted to keep an eye on us because there is a minority of fans now who will speak up and defend the Saudi Arabian regime because they're linked to the football club. So even though we're lifelong fans, police are worried that someone's going to assault us for highlighting these men's victims. Whereas on the other hand, this journalist has got nothing, that doesn't care about Newcastle at all. He's walking around with pictures of bin Salman, and he's absolutely free to do what he wants, so no concerns. And that's It kind of demonstrates to me what Newcastle United is in danger of turning into. So what can we hope to achieve, our group, and how do we address this? Well, we've asked Saudi human rights groups, what do you think would happen if there were mass protests against the regime? And they said, in their view, they aren't going to pour in billions of pounds to a sports washing project. If they're faced with mass dissent, they wouldn't do it. And a sports washing project, it does need a certain level of consent from fans. And are Newcastle United fans capable of protesting against ownership? Say pretty emphatically, yes, we've seen it. Been doing it for most of my life. The campaign in favour of the takeover is probably the biggest campaign for anything in the northeast of Gina in my lifetime. Had media, fans, councillors all working together. Unfortunately, for the exact opposite result that I would have wanted. But you can't let anyone tell you Newcastle fans aren't capable of campaigning around the ownership. And don't let anybody say fans are helpless about that. That is very, very far from the truth. We've seen it. And then there are other fans who'll point out, well, politicians and others deal with the Saudis. Why shouldn't we do it as well? And I would say, well, like Sir Boris Johnson, a lot of people don't have a lot of respect for him at all. Why would they give us any time as well? If basically all supporting Newcastle United amounts to, if you acknowledge that we can affect ownership, it's basically an unspoken understanding now that we never criticise them, and in return, we'll get some trophies delivered. Is there really any glory in that at all? On the other hand, if we were to eject this ownership from the club, as I said, there's a lot of people looking at this. We would get recognition from all over the world. And whatever you think of that, there's now a bond between the city and Saudi Arabia that just wasn't there before. When you go abroad, there's now a link there. You tell people where you're from, there's a link to Saudi Arabia that just wasn't there before. Lots of fans didn't want Mike Ashley, but I think, well, there's a lot of fans. Obviously, they don't want Mike Ashley in charge, but I don't think they want Saudi Arabia either. So that's basically what we're campaigning for now. If you agree with that, I would hope that you would support our campaign. I would hope you listen to Lina and maybe throw your weight behind our campaign or support us some way. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, thanks, Andrew, for that. It's fantastic. Now, I would say actually it's a privilege to have Lina here tonight, and I just want to explain, the reason why. Obviously, we've been campaigning, as Andrew explained, for 2 years. We've been contacted by various groups like Nic, FairSquare, the European Saudi Organisation for Human Rights, and also Lina's group. But one of the things that struck us was that, for what Nic was saying and also Andrew was saying, is that it's dangerous that the press seem to have been muted. All the cases that Andrew mentioned, that the local press haven't really held the ownership to account. And to be honest, we've heard basically propaganda from the Saudi state for the last 2 years. And we thought it's about time we heard from the people who suffer, the regime that owns the club. And that's why we invited Lina to come. And today, going around doing various interviews, it's been striking that the journalists we're talking to were, some of them, sort of taken aback by her testimony. And I'd like to invite Lina to speak for as long as you want, to explain what this is all about. Okay, so yeah. There you go.
Thank you. Do you mind me staying here?
No problem.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Lina al-Hathloul. I am now an activist. So I'm the sister of Loujain al-Hathloul here. I'll maybe start by giving my personal story and then how I got into Newcastle and so on. So my sister Loujain, she was one of the leaders of the Women to Drive campaign. So before 2018, women couldn't drive. My sister was at the forefront of this fight. She got arrested many times, and this didn't really scare her. She was also fighting to dismantle the male guardianship system, and we'll talk about this later. But basically, in Saudi Arabia, women are considered as minors till the end of our lives. For every major decision, a man has to give his consent. So our father, our husband, or even sometimes our son. So she started a campaign called I Am My Own Guardian. And so in 2018, she went to Geneva at the Human Rights Council, where there was an official Saudi delegation there to basically talk about how great the new reforms are and so on. And my sister Loujain was there just taking notes and countering what they were saying on Twitter only. And so she got back to the Middle East in February 2018, and she used to live in the Emirates. And she was kidnapped from the streets of the Emirates. She was flown back to Saudi Arabia, forcibly disappeared. My parents didn't have any news of her for a couple of days only. Then she was released. She didn't talk about what had happened that moment. And she was just put on a travel ban, meaning she couldn't leave the country. Thankfully enough, I had left the country just 2 months before I was there on vacation, but my other siblings who were still in Saudi were also trapped. So my whole family is now trapped in Saudi Arabia on a travel ban. And so fast forward a couple of months, the state security, which is basically the private police of MBS, broke into her house. They took Loujain without a warrant, without saying where they were taking her, and she was forcibly disappeared again. So she was forcibly disappeared for almost a month. Then when she called my parents, she said that she is in what she used to call a palace. We later found out that's basically a torture facility. And the first time they saw her, they saw that, she was shaking. She couldn't really grab her drink, or, it was obvious that she had been tortured, but she didn't say anything. It took 3 visits for my parents to then find out that she was tortured during that month in the unofficial prison. And she was tortured by MBS's right-hand man, Saud al-Qahtani. So he was there ordering the electrocution, the waterboarding, the flogging, everything. So this is the story of my sister. And during that time, the talks of Newcastle, of the potential takeover of Saudi, of Newcastle started. And for me, it was very personal in the sense that I had, as a family, we managed to really get media attention on our sister's case, and to raise awareness. But we thought that if this deal really goes through, then people will associate Saudi Arabia to Newcastle and not to my sister. And this is where I thought, okay, I understand what whitewashing means. And so I was really against it, saying, look, no, we have to talk about my sister, having my sister's release as a precondition. And it was very personal, I was focusing on my sister. Then my sister got released. The deal went through with a lie. Let's remember that they said the PIF had nothing to do with the Saudi government, and now they admit that the head of the PIF is the crown prince, who also ordered the torture of my sister. So again, it's very personal still. So the Newcastle deal goes through, and I start working in ALQST. So basically, what I want to really say here is that what is happening in Saudi Arabia. So at the moment where they allowed women to drive, they imprisoned the ones who have been fighting for it, and they tortured them. They execute minors. No one can speak in Saudi Arabia. The male guardianship system is still in place. Every decision made by the terrorism courts, including that one of Salma al-Shihab being sentenced to 34 years for tweeting, is held behind closed doors. So you're really in a country where there is no transparency, where everyone is targeted. Talking about money is also another thing, but as they said, I mean, they imprisoned the richest men of the country to steal their money to be able to buy all these clubs at the end of the day. So we are dealing with a brutal dictatorship. It is not a country that is reforming. You know, if you truly want to reform the country, you do it with civil society. You don't imprison people who have been asking for their rights. So what I'm saying now is that by accepting and by staying silent with such deals, including the accepting that the Saudis own Newcastle, we're emboldening and empowering a regime, and this regime is not a country, it is one-man rule. It is a family and now one-man rule. So we are giving power to MBS, green lighting, and it's even more than green lighting, we're basically enabling him. And so if we don't speak today about everything, if we don't give, you know, strict conditions to what someone like MBS can own, tomorrow it will backfire. Something that I did not mention, but when Loujain was arrested, her face was all over the media saying that she's a traitor, stamped with traitor. Saying MBS himself says that Loujain is a traitor because she is in contact with enemy states. This is in a Bloomberg interview in 2018 when he talked about my sister. When we see the charges today, so months later they had the charges, the only states that were mentioned is the fact that Loujain was in contact with diplomats of the UK, of the Netherlands and the EU. So we see how Saudi Arabia deals with the UK. I mean, you know, the UK wants under whatever condition to consider Saudi Arabia as an ally, and at the end Saudi Arabia is just okay to torture women because they were in contact with UK diplomats. So this is really insane, and I think that people really have to understand that everything is covered up. No one can speak. I mean, my own family is on a travel ban when we are, you know, we have some attention. People, you know, talk to us, and I can shed light on the violations. But imagine what is happening to the families of all these men who are on death rows. So basically, what I'm saying is that it's very dangerous to enable someone like MBS to applaud, you know, such decisions without shedding light on the abuses, and that it will backfire. I mean, MBS is someone who, I'm sure you all know, but he arrested the prime minister of a sovereign state, Lebanon. The prime minister of Lebanon was arrested in Saudi Arabia because Saudi has leverage on Lebanon. So if tomorrow Saudi Arabia has leverage on other Western countries, they'll do the same. I mean, we can't change who MBS is. We can only pressure him and, you know, put conditions and be strict about how far we're willing to give him power. So basically, empowering him today will backfire tomorrow, and it's really dangerous for everyone. And I've seen it just today. I mean, I found it quite shocking. I tried to meet MPs and councillors here, and I would say 90% of them say it explicitly that it's a political risk for them to be seen with me. So I mean, we see how dangerous it is, and it's undermining our democracies. I mean, if tomorrow MBS starts buying newspapers, news outlets, and we won't be able to have free media, you know, it just starts here. This is the thing. It's just a first step to have more power and influence and control over free industries. So maybe just for a positive note, now to end it, we're still in a phase where image is important for the Saudi regime. They still care about their image, and they still want. That's why they do as much as they can to cover up the violations, and they don't execute in public, and they start defamation campaigns against activists. Given that they care about their image, they do their best to hide everything. We should show them that we know what is happening, because the more there is pressure on specific cases, the more they're protected. So my message is just really, I mean, I've done it with my sister. It worked with the Free Loujain hashtag. It worked. Now I'm just asking. Selma is sentenced to now 27 years. She's a PhD Leeds university student. and I really think that bringing up her case every time there are Saudi talks can not only help her but show the Saudis that they cannot just double down on repression because no one speaks, that they should understand that they haven't bought everyone's silence, basically. So just, tweeting about Salma, reminding her case is already something. The 9 minors on death row it can also be helpful. It's not only about short-sighted policies of saving, such as a person or another. It's really showing the Saudis that they're trying to cover up the abuses, but we will talk about these cases and we won't stay silent, and they can't buy everyone's silence with their money, basically. So I really hope to get your support, and again, don't underestimate the power one word can have.